We are continuing our look at the 7 economic goals, and the first was what? It was improve standard of living. So it looked at the access to goods and services that make our lives better. So it looked at consumption. How much money do we have in order to buy those goods and services that make our life better? Are we getting to enjoy those goods and services? The second goal we're looking at is economic growth. So in this case, we're looking at the production of goods and services. So what is happening to the amount of goods and services that we make? Now, the challenge with economic growth is that we can make more goods and services, and typically that means that we get to consume more goods and services, right? So economic growth should go with an improved standard of living. If we produce more goods and services and we simply sell them to other countries, then we should be bringing in more income. So again, we should be able to buy more goods and services domestically as long as those are available domestically, right? So typically economic growth and improved standard of living go together, but they don't have to, okay? So when we're looking at economic growth, we're looking at a positive change in the level of production of goods and services. So how do we measure that? We measure that as real GDP per capita. So the real part means we take out inflation. Because if we produce the same number of goods and services, but they simply cost more, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are better off. So we want to take out inflation and look at whether we are actually making more goods and services. Now, the challenge is that you can't just add 2 pencils and 5 chairs, so we can't just look at quantity, which is why we take the value of them and then take out inflation. So we'll learn how to do that in the coming weeks. So real gross domestic product looks at the amount of goods and services produced, and we're going to take out that inflation, and then we're going to look at it per person. So what is really the value of what we're producing per person? And the reason we do this is because we could be making more goods and services, but if the population is growing faster than the amount we're producing, then we're not really better off. Okay? And so that comes back to that tie between economic growth and standard of living, right? We're looking at it per person because we're looking at how much is made per person, and then standard of living looks at how much you get to consume per person. So how do we increase, or how do we get economic growth? Well, there's a couple ways to get economic growth, and we'll actually dive into this in more detail later this semester, but you could increase your labor force. That is, you could get more workers to make more goods and services. Now, that comes back to the real GDP per capita. So just because you're bringing in more people, remember, you're looking at the amount of goods and services divided by the number of workers. So increasing the labor force, having more workers alone, doesn't automatically guarantee an increase in real GDP per capita, but they often go together. The other thing is to get more out of the workers that you have. So if we can get each individual to make more, if we can increase their productivity, we can get economic growth that way as well. Now, the challenge with the way that we are approximating or measuring economic growth with real GDP per capita is that not everything is included when we measure real GDP. So GDP is measured by tax returns, right? So you might report your earnings, the businesses report their revenue, and so that is how Statistics Canada estimates the GDP. So if we don't report it to Revenue Canada and Statistics Canada, then they don't know that we're producing those goods and services. So for example, things that are on the black market, illegal drugs, prostitution, if you don't report them, if you don't file a tax return, they are not included in GDP. and so they are not included in our measure of economic growth. There are other things we do that have value that if we outsource, so if you hire someone to clean your house, it would be included in GDP. But if you clean your own house, even though it has value and it is a service you're providing to your family, it's not included. We also don't include the sale of used goods. We only include the value of them when they're initially created. So we'll look into more detail about what's in GDP later this semester. But because there are things that are not included in GDP, it doesn't capture all the economic output. And so it is an approximation of economic growth. We look at that change in real GDP per capita, but it is a flawed measurement. The other challenge we have when trying to get economic growth is that we could all work more by, as we said before, you could strip mine, we could all commute more. So again, economic growth, like standard of living, doesn't really tell us about what's happening with pollution in the environment. The challenge, of course, that traffic congestion, noise, work-related stress. It's not saying anything about that. We're simply looking at the amount of stuff we're making. So that standard of living could go down if we're all killing ourselves working 3 jobs to produce more goods and services. All right, so let's look at where we stand when it comes to our second goal of economic growth. So if we look at real GDP, so we take out inflation, then what we can see over time, we go back all the way to the 20s here, is that long term we see economic growth. We are producing more goods and services than our parents and then our grandparents and so on. It's because both we have more people in our country who are working, our labor force is increasing as we have dual income households. We also see an increase in productivity, right, in terms of machines and tools, allowing each worker to make more. If we take out that long-term trend, we can look at what's happening with economic growth in the short term. So we took out that long-term slope. We can see our economic growth here. Now, when you see these dips here, these are recessions, okay, when the economy is contracting. If we have 6 months of continually declining real GDP, then we are in a recession. So half a year or 2 quarters recession. If you have 2 years of continually declining that real GDP, then you are in a depression. So you can see the economy contracting or having negative economic growth during those periods of time. And most recently, you can see here, and this of course would be 2020. You can see that contraction in the economy due to COVID as summer of 2020, Canada, many provinces and cities were closing businesses, restricting the sale of goods and services, and that has an impact on economic growth. You can also see as businesses reopen, that rebound here in 2021 as more goods and services are produced. To help us see the impact of those lockdown measures across the country, you can see here by a geographic region the impact on GDP. So China was hit first in 2020 by COVID, and you can see that contraction there. And then as COVID spreads to the rest of the world, you can start to see the impact as well. So as the pandemic initially hits, businesses are closed, there's outbreaks, so they're not producing goods and services. And then over time, we figured out a bit more how to manage the pandemic, and businesses are able to open and again produce goods and services. So you can see the size of that contraction over time. Now, we said that the way to get economic growth is to have more workers and to get more out of those workers. So increase the labor force and increase productivity. So it's important to just look at what's happening with Canadian productivity. Now, we said before that the average Canadian earns, in terms of income, what do we say? $41,135. That's Canadian. Okay. If we convert that into US dollars, we're looking at, that's about 38,351. Okay. So that would be Canadian income in US dollars. So the amount you get paid on average in Canada is just under 40 grand. The value of what the typical worker in Canada produces is close to 100 grand US. So notice you don't get paid the amount that you produce, right? Your business has overhead, they got to pay management, utilities, all those pieces. So you don't get paid the full amount of the value of the goods and services you produce. But we can look at productivity per worker by looking at the value of what you produce. And if we convert that all into US dollars, and here we're looking at in real terms, so we're taking out inflation, then we can see that in the US, the typical worker is producing about $114,000 worth of goods compared to the typical Canadian producing about 100 grand worth of goods and services. In comparison, the typical worker in China is producing about $14,000 worth of goods and services. Let me just see if I have my graph here. So we can do a comparison here of productivity by country. And what you notice is the countries that have the most productivity per worker tend to make final goods and services. That is, they sell the end product. So for example, the US sells iPhones. Other countries produce the components that go in the iPhone. If you are a country that primarily produces the raw materials that go into other products, then the value added of the product is going to be lower. And so your gross domestic product, okay, that's the final value of all goods and services produced in your country, is going to be lower. So that's why the discrepancy here, Portugal, Malaysia, India, you see lower, are primarily producing the materials that go inside of products. And then you look at Germany, US, France, those higher ones, they are producing or selling the final product. So the most value added is at the end when the product is finished. I did want to point out to you what happens to productivity over time. So what you see here on this graph is labor productivity in Canada in 2009, 2010. So 2008 into 2009 was the Great Recession. Contraction in the global economy. It was worse in other countries than it was in Canada, but because it's the closest many countries have gotten to the Great Depression, it has gotten the name the Great Recession. Now, during a recession, the economy contracts. We're concerned people are not buying goods and services, so we stop making more goods and services. We lay people off. Now, when the economy starts to improve, okay, businesses are confident again. They start producing more. Individuals are confident. They start buying more. Businesses don't immediately start hiring more workers. Instead, what they do is start paying their current workers overtime. So when we recover from a recession, you're going to see a spike in labor productivity because suddenly we're getting tons more out of our current workers because the business is not quite ready to hire more people yet, but there is an increase in demand from customers. So you tend to see that spike in labor productivity as one of the first signs that we're really getting out of a recession before you start to see all the jobs and businesses hiring more people. Now, one of the challenges in Canada is that besides that initial recovery from recessions, our labor productivity in Canada has been fairly flat for decades. And in fact, There's a number of institutions, United Nations, World Trade Organization, the Bank of Canada have all warned that one of the greatest threats to economic growth in Canada is this lack of increase in productivity.